Is there anything the government can do? Can the government modify any existing laws that might open up employment opportunities to young people?
Well, we do have a couple of other proposals, sure. One of them is not about employment law, but it's about tracking students or tracking young people into the kind of career pathways that you talk about when you say that these young people need to develop skills in order to be in demand in the economy. And that would be to establish real career-based pathways from high school into community colleges or skills training programs. So investing in the community college system is one way to create vocational pathways for these young adults.
Yeah, you know, but the best vocational pathway is an actual job where people can learn on the job by working under people who actually know how to do something, not from people who are teaching something. But I got to ask you, because we're kind of beating around it and we're not actually getting to it, because I remember I read your study. What about the minimum wage? Is there something that the government can do with the minimum wage to help create employment opportunities?
Yes. Raising the minimum wage is a good policy all around. It's a good policy for young people. It's a good policy for job creation. It's a good policy for employers. Because when you raise the minimum wage, the minimum wage, you put money into the hands of people who need to spend it. We're talking about people who spend low-income households who spend 100% of their paychecks. They get that money and they go out and they put it right back into the economy. And when they do that, it circulates. And the more money circulating in the economy becomes other people's incomes. Your local business needs to hire an additional clerk in order to keep up with the demand, and it creates new jobs. Raising the minimum wage actually has a stimulus impact on the economy. It will raise the demand for jobs. Yeah.
Catherine, we're going to have a break, but I want you to think about something during the break. It's a decent break, and you'll have enough time to collect your thoughts. But think about what you're saying. You're saying that the way to create jobs is to make them more expensive. You're thinking that we can increase demand for labor by increasing the price of labor. In other words, if we make it more expensive to hire people, you think people will hire more people when it's more expensive, rather than if we make hiring people less expensive. So we're going to talk about that. Think about it, and we'll talk about it after this commercial break. We'll be right back. We're talking with Catherine Ruetschlin of Demos about her new study, Stuck, Young America's Persistent Jobs Crisis, focusing on the big unemployment problem among our nation's youth. And Catherine, I want to talk to you a little bit about a concept called supply and demand. And we have a demand curve in economics. And the demand curve really measures demand for an item as a function of the price of that item. So in this case, let's talk about the demand for workers, hiring people, employers buying labor, which is what they do. And the demand for labor is always a function of price. Now, what you're talking about doing by raising the minimum wage is you want to make it more expensive to hire people. You're going to raise the cost of labor. And according to economics, when you do that, you will simultaneously decrease the demand for labor. So in other words, you're going to take a problem and make it worse by raising the minimum wage law. The fact of it is, and we talked about this. Well, hold on one second, then I'll have you respond. When you mentioned earlier on, and we agreed, that part of the problem is young people don't have as many skills as older people. That's why young people are disproportionately hurt by the current minimum wage, because they don't have enough skills. There are a lot of young people that are simply not worth $7 or $8 an hour. And when you add on the payroll taxes and all the other costs of hiring, we have priced our teenagers and a lot of our young people out of the labor market because they're simply, you can't employ them. They're unemployable because employers will lose money if they hire them. The only way to create jobs for people without skills is to eliminate the minimum wage so they can get jobs and then develop more skills so that later in life they can earn more money.
You know, I'm really glad that you brought this up because this story about the price of labor is one of the most persistent fallacies in economics. In fact, the effect of raising the minimum wage has been studied over and over and over again, and the effects that you're talking about just do not hold true. Those negative employment effects, that devastating effect on labor market, that doesn't appear in the real world, and the reason is this. Employers actually benefit from paying their workers a decent wage. And the reason is good workers, well-paid workers, happy workers are not only a cost They also bring returns to the firm, and they bring returns to the firm in a few different ways. One of them is if you get paid a high wage, it's more expensive for you to leave your job, so you are less likely to quit. Now, every time a worker quits, that's a cost to the firm. The firm has to pay to search for a new worker,
first
to
of all,
train a
Catherine,
new worker.
Catherine, if
Yes.
it is in an employer's interest to raise the wages of his employees, then he will do it. Employers act in their own self-interest. You're telling me that they're irrationally underpaying their workers to their own detriment, that we need the government to come in and save them from their own mistakes?
I'm actually not telling you that. Actually, there
That's
are
what you just
plenty
said.
of workers out there. No, there are many employers out there who pay a high wage based on this very observation. Costco, for example, pays a high wage. The CEO of Costco has advocated for a higher minimum wage. And the reason is Costco workers are twice as productive as workers as their competitor. And they know.
But if they're more productive, they'll earn more. I'm talking about people who are unproductive. Let me ask you a question. Do you employ anybody right now? Yourself?
I have had staff before, but right now I am not an employer.
All right, but sometimes you do employ people in a roundabout way. I mean, let's say you get your nails done at a salon.
No, I do not. But
do you get your hair cut? Does anybody cut your hair?
I absolutely use services.
How much do you pay for a haircut?
$50.
All right. Let's say you showed up to get your hair cut, and your barber or your beauty salon decided, I'm going to charge you $100 for a haircut. Would you continue to employ her, or would you look for another barber?
I'm not really sure where you're going with this hypothetical situation when we have.
Well, I want to ask you: is price
to talk about?
No, is price, and I'm asking you: is price an object? When you hire somebody to cut your hair, do you consider how much they're charging you, or do you just pay whatever they want and not care about it?
If I went to my salon and they said, "We're going to charge you double, but we're going to give you the best haircut you ever had,"
No, it's the same haircut. It's the same haircut. It's the same haircut that you're getting for.
A situation where it's the same haircut. I'm talking about the return from paying higher wages.
No. Okay, let's assume. Let's assume
it's not the
Catherine,
same employment conditions.
Okay, but let's assume that there's an unemployed young person that has very little skills, right? And they don't have a job right now, and the minimum wage is, let's say, what is it, $8 an hour, and they don't have a job, and they don't have many skills. $7.25. Okay, so the minimum wage is $7.25, and this person doesn't have a job. Now, you want me to raise the minimum wage to some higher level, maybe $9 an hour. How does it help this person who can't get a job when the minimum wage is $7.25 an hour? How is he now going to get a job when the minimum wage is $9 an hour?
I'm really glad you asked. This is a different issue with the minimum wage. The thing that you're talking about here is the level of consumer demand in the economy. How much money do people have to spend? Now, people at the lower end of the income spectrum spend all of the money they get. This is different than people at the high end of the income spectrum who funnel their money into goods that leak from the economy, long-term investments and things like that. So they don't spend 100% of their income. But if you give someone who spends 100% of their household income an extra dollar, that dollar goes back into the economy. We have estimated raising the minimum wage has been estimated to have substantial positive effects on GDP. It leads to growth. It leads to the demand for new jobs. In fact, if we were to raise the minimum wage to $10, we could create more than 100,000 new jobs just in the following year.
Look, this stuff is just too good. Is there any way you could stay with me till after the next break?
Sure, I'm happy to be here. Raising the minimum wage isn't going to solve all of our problems, and it certainly won't put 5.6 million unemployed young people back to work. But it will provide a much-needed boost to economic growth. It'll stimulate
spending. Catherine, it's not going to boost economic growth. It's going to retard economic growth. Because here's what's going to happen. If we raise the minimum wage, a number of people are going to lose their jobs. So now they're going to be moving to the unemployment rolls. Now, not everybody will lose their jobs. Some people will get raises. But, of course, the businesses that employ those people will then raise their prices to make up for the increased cost of labor. And so now everybody's going to have to pay more money for things. That will destroy purchasing power in the economy. And so the net effect of an increase in the minimum wage, it will not help the economy. It will hurt the economy, and it will destroy jobs in the very area that you've identified a problem, which is lower skilled young people.
That's not actually true, and the reason is that you're missing an important point of the process of raising a minimum wage. Raising wages for workers has an effect on the costs to the firm, not just in their wage costs, but in other costs and benefits as well. It doesn't exist in an isolated universe where you can talk about it separate from other things. So the firm raises minimum wage, and in return, they get things like lower turnover, which leads them to save money in other areas. Now, as they save money in other areas, lower turnover costs, lower hiring costs, more organizational efficiency, things like this, those are costs that they don't have to pass on to consumers. Now, they may pass a portion of a minimum wage increase on to their customer base. They may, and they probably will, but it'll be very small, and it will not offset the net improvements that are seen from a minimum wage. Moreover,
but
the
employers
people who pay
are
that
already
small cost are people who spend the most money, which is not the low-income workers who will be receiving the minimum wage, the minimum wage increase. Those workers spend less money because they have less money. So they'll still go out and spend their entire paychecks. They'll see their quality of life improve, and it will lead to economic growth. And firms aren't going to be suffering some huge burden that will cause them to shed workers.
No. Well, again, wages have to come from productivity. You just can't demand higher wages. But you just said something that earlier you denied.
And productivity includes low turnover rates and greater efficiency, which have been shown to be associated with higher wages.
If it were true that an employer could raise wages and reduce his overall costs because he would reduce his turnover, he would do it anyway. He wouldn't need a law to force him to do that. All right, but then the employers who are not doing it are not doing it for a reason, and it's because it wouldn't reduce their cost. It would increase their cost. Look, let me ask you, I asked you before about the hair cutter.
That's not actually the case. There are two separate business models that we're talking about here. We're talking about a high road and a low road. And the high road is this group of employers who pay higher wages. You've heard of Henry Ford, right? He paid his workers enough money so that they could buy his product, right?
No, that's not why he did it. He did it to reduce turnover, which is what you said. But there was no minimum wage.
Because he found a productivity benefit from paying a higher wage.
Yes,
right.
And the government didn't have to force him to do it.
So we have.
And you were talking about you. Yeah,
so
and you're talking about skilled workers.
Right. So we have a section of employers who see these benefits and raise their wages. Now we have another group of employers who follow this low road model. This low road model that keeps wages and consumer spending low, right?
So these other employers are a bunch of idiots. They're a bunch of idiots who need the government to tell them what's in their own good.
They're not a bunch of idiots. They're just not responsible for stimulus.
How high should we raise the minimum wage? Oh, I'll try to get her back. Yeah, I want to ask her how high. If raising the minimum wage is going to help the economy, then how high should we raise it? Maybe we should raise it quite a bit more. Are we getting her back? But the other thing that the other thing I want to get back and talk to her about some of her own decisions. But in the meantime, all right, Catherine? Catherine?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, so we lost you for a second, but how high should we raise the minimum wage, first of all? If you believe that raising the minimum wage is going to help the economy, I mean, what are we going to do? Raise it to $20 an hour, $30 an hour? I mean, where should we put it?
Well, the minimum wage at its height was during a time of enormous prosperity in the United States. The minimum wage's highest level was in 1968 when it hit the equivalent of about $10.63 today. Now, that was a time when the economy was booming, poverty was on the decline.
All right, well, you can't necessarily allege a causal relationship there, but
benefits, and there's no reason why we couldn't return to something like that now.
But if $10 is good, wouldn't $20 be better? Why? I mean, wouldn't the economy really get a jolt if we paid everybody $20 an hour, or why not $30 an hour?
Well, I think that what the difference between your argument and my argument is that your argument is theoretical and my argument is based on facts and history. So
What do you mean?
The facts that we see about the minimum wage is we know what happens when we change the minimum wage within a band. We don't know what happens when we change the minimum wage by 400%. And I don't think any responsible economist would go out and say, hey, let's make this drastic change that we don't know what the welfare effects will be. In fact, we do know what the welfare effects would be of a small change. And so we can confidently say raising the minimum wage to $10 an hour or to $9 an hour as the president's proposed would be a good thing for the economy and for workers and most likely for firms as well.
But so $10 would be good, but $11 would be bad?
You know, I don't know why we need to draw a line here. I'm going to draw
if you're saying that a $10 minimum wage is good, why isn't it
economy? I'm going to say $10.60.
So you just know somehow intuitively what the best what level of wages should be, and you're just going to impose it on the world because somehow you know more than the market as to what wages should be, the optimal wage.
No, I don't somehow know more than the market. I know based on history and science. I mean, there are plenty of studies that show what's possible, and so I'm not
let me ask you a quick, Catherine.
assigning a value.
Catherine. Do you have a maid? Do you have a maid?
A maid?
Yeah, that does your cleaning and your cooking for you? Why not?
No.
Why don't you hire a maid?
I like cleaning and cooking, but I see what you're getting at because you think that if I could afford one, I would have one.
Yeah, wouldn't you?
I doubt it, but that's not really
okay. There are plenty of services that I would use. Catherine, if I send somebody over to your house and I said she's going to do all your cooking and cleaning and all your shopping for $1 a week, that's all it's going to cost you. Would you take her?
There are plenty of services that I would utilize if I had more money to spend on them.
But it's the same thing if the price was lower. If you can hire a maid cheap enough, you would have one, right?
Once again, you've devolved into these theoretical constructs.
It's not theoretical. It's an actual question.
Talk about things abstractly.
What is preventing you? What is preventing you from hiring a maid?
We have history to draw from.
No, I don't want history. I'm asking you. What's preventing you from hiring a maid? You can't afford it because the maids are too expensive. If you could get one cheaper, you would hire one. That's the only point. I'm an employer, Catherine. I employ 150 people, probably more. I know a lot of employers. Believe me, cost is extremely important, especially for young people who have very little skills. There is no reason to hire them. Before, Catherine, before there was a minimum wage, you want to look at history? Catherine, hold on. You want to look at history? Before there was a minimum wage, there was no unemployment problem for young people. It was none. There was no difference between teenage unemployment and adult unemployment. It didn't exist. It was legislated into existence with the minimum wage. So you got to go back and look at history because I'm the one that knows history. You're living in a fantasy land. It doesn't work that way. It's supply and demand. The best way to create demand for labor is to reduce the cost of labor, the price of labor, and the reason that's not happening is because the minimum wage is the dumbest law we have because it mandates permanent unemployment and it takes the bottom rung of the job ladder out from under young people. They never get a chance to get their first job, so they can't get their second job. They can't get their third job because the government has destroyed that opportunity. And what you need to do is you need to look at what real economists say, not a bunch of people with agendas. You know who really supports the minimum wage laws? Labor unions, because it destroys competition. In fact, that's where the minimum wage came from. It came from big labor unions trying to keep unskilled people unemployed so they can charge more money for their skilled workers. But hey, Catherine, thanks for sticking around. We got a commercial break. We got to go. We'll be back for more of the Peter Schiff Show after this. This is the Peter Schiff Show. You know, a part of me wished that I kept Catherine on. I could talk to her probably all day, but I couldn't turn it into the whole show. But I got to make a couple just final comments, and I'm going to take some phone calls. You know, one of the things that she was trying to say was, you know, history, go back to the 1960s, and we had a higher minimum wage, and we had a stronger economy, as if the higher minimum wage was the reason that the economy was better. It had nothing to do with it. In fact, the economy would have been even better had we had no minimum wage. And, of course, the economy was better in America when we had no minimum wage. You know, when I brought that point up in the break, as we were saying goodbye, and she said she had a good time on the show, but as she was saying goodbye, she said, I can't believe you want to go back to the days where parents sent their infants into the labor market. What does that have to do with anything? I just want a free market. But, she said that we should look at history. Well, we don't have to look at history. Look at Singapore. Singapore is one of the only nations not dumb enough to have a minimum wage. Singapore has no minimum wage law, and the unemployment rate in Singapore is 1.8%. 1.8%. We've never had unemployment in my lifetime in America as low as 1.8%. That's what it is in Singapore. There is no minimum wage law in Singapore. Now you think, well, Singapore, they must be all poor people. No, Singapore has the highest, I think, per capita income there is. I think and in fact, it has the highest concentration of millionaires in the world live in Singapore. And so it is an extremely prosperous society, one of the highest savings rates, huge exports, huge current account surplus, gigantic creditor nation. Their economy is booming, and there is no minimum wage. According to my guest, employers are a bunch of idiots who just underpay their workers. If they only were smart enough to raise wages, they would actually lower their costs because their workers would be happier. They wouldn't want to quit because they'd have these great high-paying jobs. They would be more productive. Everything would be great if only these stupid idiot businessmen who somehow are smart enough to run a business, but they're too stupid to know what's in their own good. Because she did mention that Henry Ford paid people more than a minimum wage. Of course, well, there was no minimum wage back then, but Henry Ford paid his workers a certain amount of money because he made a decision that based on the work they were doing and the skills that they needed and how much time and effort he put into training them, that he needed a higher wage. But there were plenty of other people who made a different decision that based on the people they were hiring, they didn't need a minimum wage. In fact, if you had forced everybody to pay the same type of wages as Henry Ford, you probably would have created massive unemployment, and then Henry Ford probably would have had to lay a bunch of people off because the economy would be so weak that people wouldn't be able to afford to buy his Model Ts. One more fact I meant to throw out. I looked up the per capita income of Singapore versus the U.S. This is, 2012 figures, but per capita income in the United States, $49,000, Singapore, $60,500. So even though there is no minimum wage, workers end up earning more money in an economy that has no minimum wage and have virtually no unemployment. Because when your unemployment rate is 1.8%, that's just the friction. There's always going to be some people that are in between jobs. So 1.8% basically means there is no unemployment in Singapore. And why is there no unemployment in Singapore? Because you don't have unemployment unless the government erects a barrier to prevent it. My guest, Catherine, kept saying that there are all these workers that have skills and that they're not being hired. Well, I would say they don't have a lot of skills, but the young people who aren't working, they do have something of value to offer. The problem is what they have to offer is not worth the minimum wage, so they can't sell what they have. But if there was no minimum wage, they would all get jobs. That's what happens in Singapore. There's no minimum wage, and so if you're only worth $2 an hour, then you work for $2 an hour. But you know what? If you're only worth $2 an hour, you got a big problem, right? How do you solve that problem? You get a job, you take the $2 an hour, and you learn something. You figure out how to improve the value of your labor. You acquire more skills so that you can get a job for $4 an hour or $5 an hour or $10 an hour. How do you solve the problem of somebody who's only worth $2 an hour if you have a minimum wage of $7.25? You've compounded their problems because now not only are they worth $2 an hour, but they have no chance of ever increasing their value. They're stuck at being worth $2 an hour because they can't get a job. They can't acquire any of the skills that would increase their value. You see, you don't have that problem in Singapore. If you're only worth $2 an hour, you know what? You get a job, you get paid that lousy $2 an hour, and you learn. You make yourself more valuable so that you can get a raise, and then you can get another raise. You climb up that ladder. But in America, we've abolished that ladder. If you're only worth $2 an hour, you're never going to get a job. You're stuck in permanent poverty. All you can do is commit crimes, you can steal money, or you can live on welfare. Now, is that better than taking a $2 an hour job? Now, of course, my guest would say, well, nobody should have to work for $2 an hour. Well, you know what? If you work for $2 an hour, you're not going to work for $2 an hour for long. Probably after 6 months, 3 months, you're probably going to get a raise. I mean, you're going to learn something. And, you know, who would take those jobs at $2 an hour or $3 an hour? It'd be teenagers, 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds, not infants, young kids living at home. That doesn't matter. The experience is worth more than the paycheck. Just having a job, just showing up. I mean, a lot of young people work for nothing. It's called internships. How many people work for nothing in this country? So if it's okay for people to work for nothing, why can't they work for a low pay? Because a low pay is better than no pay, but apparently it's okay to hire people and pay them nothing. But you can't pay them $2 or $3 or $4 an hour. That's illegal. Let me go back to the phones. I've got Emeka calling in from Jackson Island, New Jersey. Emeka, welcome to the show.
Hey, Peter. It was nice listening to the interview. The one thing that I found kind of disconcerting was that the lady had a PhD. Oh, she's a PhD candidate at the new school, and I was like, no, she doesn't really understand, like, supply and demand. And when you asked her the question, like, why not raise it to $20 an hour or $30 an hour, she said that she doesn't want to draw a line in the sand, but she wants to raise it specifically to $10.50 an hour. She doesn't really even understand her own point.
Yeah, I mean, if 1060, I said if 1060 is good, why isn't 11 better? I mean, at what point? I mean, that's how you show that the argument doesn't make sense. If raising it is good, see, at some point they have to say, well, then you'd make it too expensive and people couldn't get jobs. Well, then at what point does that happen? Because once they acknowledge that, then they destroy their argument. You can't say that. You can't say that, you know, because they're trying to say that demand is not a function of price.
Yeah, that's essentially her argument. She doesn't really like understand economics, and she has no business being on the PhD track on anything like in regards to econ.
Well, I'm sure she would get a lot of sympathy from Paul Krugman. He probably supports the exact same idea, and he's got a Nobel Prize in economics. So, you know, there are plenty of people who have PhDs in economics that believe this nonsense. And, you know, how could you have a PhD in a subject you don't even understand?
Yeah, I agree. But also, like, in regards to, like, she said that you didn't know, like, history or something, but, like, she's the one who doesn't know history. She doesn't understand that, like, you know, the entire idea of, like, unskilled unemployment is, like, relatively contemporary. Like, if you talk to Walter Williams and talk about his, like, upbringing, he always had a job. Like, he was making, like $1 and something an hour. Like, every kid he knew had a job. Like, it's a contemporary thing where someone doesn't have a job without skills.
Yeah, I mean, she is basically, according to her bio, she's completing her PhD in economics, right? A PhD in economics, and she doesn't understand supply and demand. That is the basic, that is the backbone of economics. That's like somebody having a PhD in mathematics and doesn't understand addition. They can't add 2 and 2 together. They don't know that it's 4, yet they got a PhD in mathematics. I mean, how can you understand mathematics if you don't know the basics? Supply and demand is the basic. That's Econ 101. That's the first day when you're a freshman in econ class. The very first thing that the teacher should do is draw a graph of supply and demand up on the board. I mean, that's it. And then you learn from there. How could you not know that and be in a PhD program?
Yeah, I agree. It's pretty disconcerting.
Yeah, well, look, that's why I say, and that was part of her solution for the unemployment problem was to have more kids in school. Yeah, that's the last thing we need is to send these kids to school. They need jobs. And why can't they get jobs? Because the government made it illegal for employers to hire them. That's why. But, hey, thank you for the call. Mike is calling in from New York City. Mike, welcome to the show.
Hey, good morning. Just first off, I think while labor unions can benefit from the minimum wage, I think it was really started by the Fed and their and by them being able to create inflation. I think that's the natural origin.
Actually, Mike, the minimum wage I think came in 1931, part of the Davis-Bacon Act. I think it was 31. But I'm looking at an article by Walter Williams. But it's interesting because he quotes a lot of the people who were in favor of the minimum wage. And a lot of it was they were worried about colored labor, Negro labor, which was driving down wages. And he has one quote here from one of the advocates from the American Federation of Labor, the president, William Green. And here's what he said in defense of the minimum wage and why we needed it. Quote, colored labor is being sought to demonize wage rates. So in other words, the labor unions were worried that blacks were being hired at lower wages, and it was competing with the labor unions. And so they wanted to prevent blacks from getting jobs, and so they knew a minimum wage would do it. And so it was actually introduced to try to destroy jobs and protect higher wage jobs from competition from lower skilled, lower paid people. But thanks for the call. And Walter Williams always makes some great points. I wish my former guest would read some of Walter Williams' books on unemployment and the minimum wage law